Beneath the golden lights of a Roman banquet, Prince Britannicus raised his cup of wine. Moments later, his body convulsed, collapsing before the cold stare of Nero. At just 30 years old, the only son of Emperor Claudius, the rightful heir to the throne, was poisoned in silence. His death was not only a family tragedy, but the opening act of Nero's bloody reign. Born in 41 AD, Britannicus entered the world with a weight of expectation heavy on his shoulders. He was not simply a child of privilege, but the direct son of Emperor Claudius and Empress Messalina, a legitimate heir to the Julio-Claudian dynasty, a bloodline that traced back to the first emperor, Augustus. In the complicated web of Roman politics, this legitimacy mattered more than anything else. It was the thread that tied Britannicus not only to the throne, but also to the hopes of those who yearned for stability in an empire marked by conspiracies, sudden assassinations, and shifting loyalties. The early years of Britannicus were wrapped in pomp and ceremony. His name, Decimus Claudius Britannicus, was chosen to commemorate Claudius's triumphs in Britain, a reminder that Rome's empire stretched beyond the known horizons. As the infant heir, Britannicus was a living symbol of conquest, victory, and continuity. Whenever he was presented to the people, cheers rose in the streets, for his very existence promised that the imperial line would not be broken. Yet even as a child, Britannicus was not free to live as children do. He was raised in the palatial halls of the imperial household, a space more like a political theater than a family home. His every gesture, every word, was scrutinized by tutors, attendants, and guards. He was trained in rhetoric, literature, and the traditions of Rome, because one day, it was expected, he would sit upon the throne. But within this golden cage lay danger. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was infamous for its turbulence. Each emperor since Augustus had risen and fallen under clouds of suspicion, betrayal, or bloodshed. Britannicus's position as the only legitimate son of Claudius made him not only a beacon of hope, but also a target for envy and fear. His mother, Messalina, played a significant role in shaping these early years. Known for her beauty and her manipulative nature, she wielded great influence in court. She lavished attention upon her son, surrounding him with tutors and protectors. To her, Britannicus was more than a child. He was her safeguard, her anchor to power. As long as her son remained the heir, her own place in the empire seemed secure. For Rome's elite, Britannicus's existence offered a sense of continuity. Senators, soldiers, and citizens alike saw in him a future emperor who bore the unquestionable blood of Claudius. Unlike others who might come to power through adoption, manipulation, or force, Britannicus was born with destiny etched into his veins. Still, destiny in Rome was fragile. Every step of Britannicus's early life unfolded in an environment poisoned by whispers, plots, and rivalries. Even as he learned his lessons and grew into boyhood, his path to the throne was anything but certain. His inheritance, though rightful, was a prize that others would covet. If Britannicus's birth carried the glow of promise, his childhood soon descended into shadows. In 48 AD, tragedy struck with brutal suddenness. His mother, Messalina, was accused of treason and executed by order of her husband, Emperor Claudius. Britannicus was only 7 years old when he lost not just his mother, but also the most powerful protector he had within the palace walls. Messalina's downfall left a scar that never truly faded. The young boy who had once been cherished as the heir to Rome now wandered the corridors of the imperial palace with an emptiness that no title could fill. He remained Claudius's son, still a prince in name. But his safety and his future had become dangerously uncertain. Without Messalina's influence, the powers surrounding Britannicus began to fracture. The Roman court was no place for innocence. It was a nest of intrigue, where alliances shifted overnight and where daggers, both literal and political, waited in the shadows. Britannicus, still only a child, was forced to watch as those around him calculated his worth not as a boy, but as a pawn. He learned too early that affection in the imperial family could be fleeting, and loyalty was often an illusion. His tutors continued their lessons, training him in law, literature, and military traditions. But whispers crept into his ears, that he was no longer the center of Claudius's attention, that others might one day replace him. Each passing day deepened the gap between the promise of his birth and the reality of his circumstances. The execution of Messalina also served as a grim warning to Britannicus. It revealed the precarious nature of power, even for those closest to the emperor. His mother, once untouchable, had been struck down overnight. For a child growing up in such a brutal environment, the lesson was chilling. In Rome, even blood ties offered no shield. This tragedy isolated Britannicus. Without a mother's guidance, he became increasingly dependent on the few allies left in the palace. Yet those allies, fearing Claudius's wrath or the shifting tides of politics, often kept their distance. Britannicus's childhood, meant to be a time of joy and learning, became a stage for solitude and suspicion. The empire outside the palace thrived. Armies marched, cities bustled, senators debated. But for Britannicus, life was confined to gilded walls that felt more like a prison. His laughter, once encouraged, grew rarer. His eyes, once bright with curiosity, began to reflect the weary caution of someone far older than his years. By the time he approached adolescence, Britannicus had already been hardened by loss and by fear. He understood, even if he never said it aloud, that his future would not be secure simply because of his birthright. Rome did not reward innocence, it devoured it. The entrance of Agrippina the Younger into Britannicus's life marked the beginning of a dangerous shift. After the death of Messalina, Emperor Claudius found himself vulnerable, both politically and personally. Rome demanded stability, and Claudius chose to marry again, this time to his ambitious niece, Agrippina. For the young Britannicus, this new marriage was more than a domestic change. It was the opening act of a struggle that would determine his very survival. Agrippina was unlike Messalina. If Messalina had wielded influence through beauty, intrigue, and personal indulgence, Agrippina was cold, calculating, and utterly focused on power. She understood the machinery of empire better than most men in the Senate, and she had a singular goal: to secure the throne for her own son, Nero. From the moment she entered the palace, Agrippina began to reshape its dynamics. Britannicus, once the central figure of Claudius's household, found himself gradually sidelined. Banquets, ceremonies, and public appearances that had once celebrated his status as heir now increasingly highlighted Nero. Agrippina orchestrated this transformation with precision, ensuring that Nero's presence grew stronger while Britannicus faded into the background. The relationship between Britannicus and Nero was never one of brotherhood. Nero, older by 3 years, was introduced as a foster son, but Agrippina's influence quickly blurred the lines of hierarchy. Tutors and attendants who once devoted themselves to Britannicus began to focus on Nero. Even Claudius, swayed by Agrippina's relentless persuasion, started to favor her son. Behind closed doors, Britannicus's frustration grew. He was aware of the shifting loyalties around him. The court whispered of Nero's charm, his skill in oratory, his carefully cultivated public image. By contrast, Britannicus was portrayed as a boy in the shadows, an afterthought in the grand spectacle of Rome. For the Roman elite, the emergence of Nero as a potential heir sparked mixed reactions. Some recognized his talents and Agrippina's formidable will as signs of strength. Others remained loyal to Britannicus, acknowledging his bloodline as the only legitimate claim to the throne. This division within the court created an undercurrent of tension that Britannicus could not ignore. To him, Agrippina was no motherly figure. She was a rival, perhaps even a predator. He must have sensed the danger as her influence deepened. Agrippina maneuvered carefully, placing her allies in key positions, silencing dissent and gradually isolating Britannicus. What had once been his father's palace became a battlefield of manipulation, where every gesture, every glance carried hidden meaning. As Britannicus entered adolescence, the contrast between him and Nero sharpened. Nero performed music, delivered speeches, and enjoyed the admiration of the masses. Britannicus, though equally capable, was given fewer opportunities to shine. It was not his lack of ability that dimmed his star. It was Agrippina's deliberate effort to push him into obscurity. The boy who had once been Rome's promise now lived in the shadow of another. And in the Roman world, to lose visibility was to lose power. Britannicus could not yet know the full extent of Agrippina's ambition, but the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. The year 54 AD brought a turning point that would seal Britannicus's fate. Emperor Claudius, his father and protector, died suddenly under circumstances that many believed were anything but natural. Ancient historians, including Tacitus and Suetonius, wrote that Claudius was poisoned, most likely at the hands of Agrippina, who feared that the aging emperor might one day restore Britannicus as heir. The imperial court was thrown into chaos. Britannicus, still only 13, should have stepped forward as the rightful successor. His bloodline was unquestionable, his claim to the throne undeniable. Yet power in Rome rarely followed the straight line of legitimacy. Agrippina had prepared meticulously for this moment, ensuring that her son Nero would ascend without opposition. Within hours of Claudius's death, Agrippina moved swiftly. She concealed the emperor's passing long enough to rally supporters, secure the Praetorian Guard's loyalty, and summon the Senate to proclaim Nero as emperor. When the announcement was made, Nero, just 17 years old, stood before Rome as its new ruler. Britannicus, meanwhile, was pushed to the margins, reduced from heir to an inconvenient reminder of what should have been. The speed of Nero's elevation stunned many. Senators who might have backed Britannicus found themselves outmaneuvered, their voices drowned out by Agrippina's control of the narrative. The Praetorian Guard, the ultimate arbiters of succession, had been bribed and persuaded to support Nero. Against such orchestrated power, the young Britannicus stood no chance. For Britannicus, the loss was devastating. He had grown up believing that his father's throne would one day be his. Instead, he was forced to watch as Nero, the adopted son of Claudius, claimed the empire. Worse still, Britannicus understood that his very existence posed a threat to the new regime. As long as he lived, whispers of his legitimacy would haunt Nero's reign. Publicly, Nero and Britannicus were portrayed as brothers, bound by loyalty. But privately, the atmosphere was charged with suspicion. Nero, aware of Britannicus's rightful claim, treated him with a mixture of disdain and fear. Agrippina, though victorious, also recognized that Britannicus remained a dangerous symbol, a rallying point for any senator, general, or conspirator who wished to challenge Nero's rule. The halls of the palace, once familiar to Britannicus, became hostile terrain. He was watched closely, his words measured, his movements restricted. Every friend could be a spy, every servant a potential betrayer. Britannicus was learning the cruel reality of Roman politics. Legitimacy meant nothing without power, and power was something Agrippina and Nero would never share. Claudius's death had transformed Britannicus overnight. From heir apparent, he became an outcast in his own home. The golden promise of his birth was now a shadow, a fragile memory. In the eyes of Rome, he was still Claudius's son, still noble by blood. But in the eyes of Nero, he was an obstacle that would one day have to be removed. And so, in the silence that followed Claudius's funeral, the fate of Britannicus darkened. The empire had chosen its new master, and the true heir was left behind, standing at the edge of power, watching as history began to erase him. Although Nero sat on the throne, Britannicus remained a constant reminder of what could have been. To many in Rome, he was still the true heir, the son of Claudius by blood rather than by adoption. This legitimacy gnawed at Nero's sense of security. No matter how many parades he led or how many coins bore his image, whispers of Britannicus's rightful claim echoed through the empire. Among senators, nobles, and even common citizens, conversations often returned to the same point. Nero might be emperor, but Britannicus was the one Rome had expected to lead. These whispers, carried by servants, repeated in private villas, and murmured in the Senate halls, were more dangerous than open rebellion. They created the possibility of an alternative, and in Rome, the idea of an alternative ruler could ignite civil war. For Britannicus, these whispers were both a lifeline and a curse. On one hand, they proved that he was not forgotten, that Rome still saw him as its legitimate prince. On the other hand, they made him a target. Nero could not tolerate even the suggestion of a rival, especially one so close and so legitimate. The court became a theater of quiet hostility. Nero's every glance toward Britannicus carried suspicion. Banquets, once moments of family celebration, turned into displays of dominance. Britannicus would sit in silence, aware that eyes were watching him, weighing his every reaction. The tension was suffocating. Yet Britannicus did not need to conspire actively against Nero to threaten him. Simply by existing, by breathing in the same halls, he symbolized a threat. To Rome's restless elite, Britannicus was a rallying point waiting to be used. If Nero faltered, if public opinion turned against him, Britannicus could easily be lifted up as the savior, the rightful emperor who had been denied his inheritance. This possibility was intolerable to Nero. He was young, insecure, and heavily influenced by his mother, Agrippina. Though he ruled as emperor, his throne was not yet steady. He could feel the empire's gaze shifting, calculating, considering whether Britannicus might be the safer bet. For a ruler so desperate for approval, this silent rivalry was unbearable. Agrippina herself likely reinforced these fears. She knew that as long as Britannicus lived, Nero's position was not invulnerable. And in the ruthless logic of Roman politics, vulnerability demanded action. To preserve power, enemies, real or imagined, had to be eliminated. For Britannicus, the palace grew darker with each passing day. He must have sensed the hostility tightening around him like a noose. He had seen enough of Roman history to know that rivals rarely lived long. Perhaps he hoped that his youth or his innocence would shield him. Perhaps he trusted that the bond of brotherhood might hold some weight. But in Rome, brotherhood had little meaning when weighed against the allure of absolute power. Nero's jealousy, Agrippina's ambition, and the whispers of the court all combined to form the spark of deadly intent. Britannicus's very presence was the fuse, and sooner or later, someone would light it. Nero's decision to remove Britannicus did not come suddenly. It was the product of mounting paranoia, whispered counsel, and the cold arithmetic of survival. At just 17 years old, Nero had already learned that emperors who hesitated did not remain emperors for long. His mother's example, her ruthless efficiency in securing his throne, had shown him the path. Threats had to be neutralized. The plan was simple in concept, but sinister in execution. Britannicus would be killed in a way that made resistance impossible, suspicion minimal, and consequences unlikely. Poison, the weapon of choice in Rome's imperial circles, was perfect. It could be administered quietly, leaving little trace, and its effects could be disguised as illness. To carry out the plot, Nero relied on his inner circle. Among them was Locusta, a notorious poisoner whose skills were so infamous that she would later be kept under imperial protection. With her expertise, a substance was prepared that could bring swift death. The goal was not only to eliminate Britannicus, but to do so publicly, dramatically, and irreversibly. Secrecy cloaked the conspiracy. Servants were bribed, guards were instructed, and preparations were made. In the palace, Britannicus was watched carefully. His routines were studied, his habits noted. Every opportunity was considered, but the most effective stage would be one where no one could intervene. A banquet, where the crowd's attention could be diverted, and where Britannicus would appear vulnerable, even ordinary. Nero himself may have masked his intent with gestures of false brotherhood. Smiles, invitations, and words of courtesy likely hid the blade of betrayal. To Britannicus, the emperor's sudden kindness may have seemed suspicious, yet he had little choice but to accept it. In the imperial court, refusal could be as dangerous as compliance. Behind the polished marble walls, the poison waited. It was a weapon silent and sure, a drop of death mixed into wine. To the courtiers who would witness it, the moment might seem like an accident, a sudden illness. To Nero, it was a performance, a demonstration of power so absolute that it could extinguish his rival in plain sight. For Britannicus, unaware of the details, life continued with a fragile normalcy. But shadows hung over him. Every meal could be his last. Every servant's gesture could conceal betrayal. The palace, once his home, had become a stage where the script of his death was being written. In this dark atmosphere, fear was not only Britannicus's companion, but also the court's. Those who suspected the plan dared not speak. To protect oneself in Rome often meant silence, even when the truth was obvious. And so the conspiracy tightened its grip, unseen but inevitable, as Britannicus moved step by step toward his fatal night. The empire itself remained unaware of the storm brewing behind the gilded doors. To the outside world, Rome appeared strong, Nero's reign secure. But within, in the corridors lit by torchlight and guarded by soldiers, the doom of Britannicus was already sealed. The night of the banquet was staged with the opulence Rome was famous for. Golden lamps illuminated marble walls, music drifted through the air, and courtiers laughed as goblets of wine clinked together. To any observer, it was a night of celebration, a ritual of Roman grandeur. But beneath the surface, death had been invited to the table. Britannicus entered the hall as he had so many times before, dressed in princely attire but overshadowed by the presence of Nero. The emperor, radiant in his youth and draped in imperial robes, commanded every gaze. Britannicus, though born to the throne, walked like a ghost through a palace that had already forgotten him. Nero, playing the role of benevolent brother, welcomed him with a calculated smile. Courtiers noted the gesture, whispering among themselves that perhaps reconciliation had softened the emperor's heart. But those closest to Nero knew better. His smile was not born of affection, but of anticipation. The poison was ready, and the stage was set. As the feast continued, servants carried dishes of roasted meats, fruits, and amphorae of wine. Britannicus's cup was prepared separately, a small detail that passed unnoticed in the chaos of abundance. Into it, the lethal draught was poured, a dose measured not to linger, but to strike swiftly and without mercy. When the cup was placed before him, Britannicus had no reason to refuse. Surrounded by peers, attendants, and his own stepbrother, he lifted the goblet to his lips. Perhaps in that moment, he felt the weight of suspicion. Perhaps he had learned enough of palace intrigue to wonder whether the drink was safe. But hesitation was impossible. In the Roman court, declining an emperor's hospitality was more dangerous than the drink itself. The poison took hold almost immediately. Britannicus's body stiffened, his face contorted in agony, and his hands clawed at the table as if searching for air. Gasps filled the hall, voices rose in panic, but no one dared to move. The courtiers watched in horror as the son of Claudius, the rightful heir to the throne, collapsed before their eyes. Nero remained calm. With chilling composure, he waved his hand and declared that Britannicus was merely suffering from an epileptic fit, a condition that had plagued him since childhood. His explanation silenced the murmurs. No one dared to contradict the emperor, though many must have known the truth. To speak would mean death. To remain silent was survival. The music faltered, the laughter died, and an oppressive silence spread through the banquet hall. Britannicus writhed on the marble floor for a few agonizing moments before his body stilled. The banquet continued, but its joy had curdled into dread. For those present, the memory of Britannicus's final cries would never fade. And yet, in that instant, history shifted. Britannicus's death was not only the silencing of a rival, it was a message. Nero had shown the court that no one, not even the son of Claudius, was beyond his reach. The aftermath of the poisoning was as chilling as the act itself. Britannicus lay lifeless amid the splendor of the imperial feast, his body framed by gold, silk, and marble. His death had come in a hall filled with Rome's most powerful men and women, yet no hand had reached to save him. In that silence, fear revealed its true dominion. The courtiers returned to their seats, pretending to eat and drink while avoiding one another's eyes. To acknowledge what had just occurred was to risk their lives. Nero's explanation that Britannicus had succumbed to epilepsy was thin, almost insulting, but it was accepted nonetheless. The court had no choice but to accept lies as truth, because the truth was deadly. For Britannicus, there was no honor in death. Unlike emperors who were deified, generals who were celebrated, or martyrs who were remembered, his passing was swallowed in silence. There were no public ceremonies, no monuments erected, no songs sung in his name. His body was hurried away, buried quietly without the pomp befitting a prince of Rome. The irony was cruel. Britannicus had died surrounded by the wealth of empire, yet stripped of the dignity his birth should have guaranteed. He was the son of Claudius, the legitimate heir to Augustus's line. Yet his end was like that of a criminal, hidden, diminished, erased. The banquet itself resumed in a grotesque parody of normalcy. Music returned, voices rose again, and servants poured wine into trembling hands. But beneath the laughter lay a current of dread. Every courtier knew that what had happened to Britannicus could happen to them. The palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was a stage for execution, dressed in silk and gold. Nero had crossed a threshold. By killing Britannicus in plain view, he declared that legitimacy meant nothing, that bloodlines could be snuffed out with a gesture. It was not simply the death of a rival, but the birth of a reign defined by terror. From this night forward, fear would be Nero's most loyal ally. For Britannicus, the tragedy was complete. His 30 years of life had carried the promise of empire, yet they ended in betrayal, silence, and neglect. He left behind no heirs, no legacy but the memory of a prince betrayed by his own family. And for Rome, the night of Britannicus's death became a prophecy. The empire, which had once looked to him as a stabilizing force, now belonged fully to Nero, a ruler who had shown he would kill without hesitation, even at his own table. The golden walls of the palace gleamed as brightly as ever. But beneath them, Rome had entered a darker age. The silence that followed Britannicus's death was more powerful than any cry of protest. In the days after the banquet, Rome's elite avoided even whispering his name. Those who had witnessed the poisoning carried the memory like a weight, yet none dared to speak. In the imperial court, survival depended on silence, and silence meant complicity. The funeral of Britannicus was a muted affair. There were no grand processions, no triumphal honors, no songs sung by poets. His body was laid to rest quickly and discreetly, as though the empire wished to erase his existence. The contrast was stark. Emperors were usually memorialized with temples and divine honors, but Britannicus, the legitimate heir of Claudius, was buried like an afterthought. For Nero, this was the desired outcome. He wanted Britannicus not only dead, but forgotten. By controlling the narrative, by insisting that Britannicus had suffered from a seizure, Nero ensured that his rival's legacy dissolved into obscurity. To the people of Rome, the death of the prince became another rumor, another mystery, something better left unspoken. Yet beneath the silence lay fear. Senators who had once quietly considered Britannicus a possible rallying point now recognized the danger of even entertaining such thoughts. The Praetorian Guard, whose loyalty could make or break emperors, understood the message. The boy who had once been their rightful emperor had been eliminated without hesitation, and their duty was to Nero alone. For those closest to Britannicus, grief was suffocated by caution. Friends who might have mourned him publicly dared not risk their lives. Servants who had once served him avoided even mentioning his name. In Rome's heart, Britannicus became a ghost, present in memory but absent in voice. The people of Rome, too, felt the chill. They had not seen Britannicus's death firsthand, but whispers trickled into the streets. Some remembered the boy who had once been paraded before them as Claudius's heir. Others speculated that his death was no accident. Yet fear of imperial retribution kept them quiet. In Nero's Rome, suspicion could be fatal. This silence was itself a form of violence. Britannicus's story, his legitimacy, his very presence, was buried beneath layers of denial. It was as though Rome had conspired to erase him from history, leaving only a faint shadow where a prince once stood. The court, however, had learned a lesson that night. No one was untouchable. If Britannicus could be murdered in full view of Rome's elite, then no senator, no noble, no ally could ever feel secure. Nero's reign had begun not only with the crown, but with blood, and that blood stained every hand that chose to remain still. The death of Britannicus was more than a personal tragedy. It was the symptom of a dynasty unraveling. The Julio-Claudian line, once founded on Augustus's promise of stability and prosperity, had descended into paranoia, betrayal, and bloodshed. Britannicus, the legitimate son of Claudius, was crushed beneath this weight of ambition and fear. His fate revealed the fragility of legitimacy in Rome. Bloodline alone could not protect him. Inheritance meant little without the support of soldiers, senators, and the machinery of power. In an empire where poison could be slipped into a cup at dinner, heritage was no shield at all. For Nero, the elimination of Britannicus marked the consolidation of his power. But it also set a precedent that would define his reign. The emperor who began by killing his own brother would go on to embody tyranny, cruelty, and excess. The death of Britannicus was the first act in a drama that would see Nero turn against his mother, his wives, his allies, and even his empire itself. For Rome, the silence surrounding Britannicus's death was a warning of darker days. The court had chosen to accept lies over truth, safety over justice. That choice allowed Nero's reign of terror to flourish. Every senator who bowed his head, every courtier who remained quiet, helped pave the way for the atrocities to come. And for Britannicus himself, the tragedy was complete. He left behind no heirs, no monuments, no triumphs. His story was not celebrated in marble or gold, but hidden in whispers and half-remembered accounts. Yet within that obscurity lies the measure of his fate. He was the prince who should have been emperor, the heir whose crown was stolen by poison. History remembers Britannicus, not for what he achieved, but for what was taken from him. His life, extinguished at 30, stands as a symbol of how even the most legitimate heir could be erased in a heartbeat. In Rome, survival belonged not to the rightful, but to the ruthless. The banquet where he died was not only the scene of his final breath. It was the moment the empire declared that blood ties, honor, and tradition meant nothing before power. That night crystallized the essence of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, an empire built on ambition, sustained by fear, and poisoned from within. Britannicus's doomed fate serves as a haunting reminder of Rome's darkest truth. In the pursuit of absolute power, family meant nothing, and loyalty was as fragile as a cup of wine.